So this is a project that I've been working on for some years. It's co-authored with Maya Sen. So when I say we, it's not royal we, it's an acronym. And the question is, how are the politics and ideology around genomic science developing? There's a broad theoretical question, which is how does an issue come into the political arena and become politicized or become attached to ideological commitments or not? So, for example, if you think about stem cell research, in about 30 seconds it got attached to abortion politics. More generally, cancer research over the last 30 or 40 years hasn't been sort of broadly politicized. Kind of everybody's in favor of more research and more spending in NIH, setting aside budgetary issues. There's a more particular issue around genomic science, and it has to do with the, again, very, very broadly put, traditionally, historically, for absolutely obvious and good reasons, any association between race and biology is just poisonous in American society, in American politics, and American practice. What genomic science does is raise the issue that we can, or we must, or we should not, or we absolutely must avoid reinventing that link between biology and race. So that's kind of how I got into the project. It's expanded in a bunch of different directions, but that's the kind of the underlying moral and normative and ideological question around which this project is kind of circling. Okay, so I always start with this quotation from The Economist, in part because it suggests the importance of genomics. If genomics is in fact reminiscent of the physical sciences at the beginning of the 20th century, think about physics in 1915. Right? We had no idea what it was going to produce over the next century. If this analogy is correct, we have no idea what genomics is going to produce over the next century, and if it's as big as physics, it's going to transform the world. The other reason this is very useful, of course, is the last phrase. The analogy will continue for both good and ill, and that again raises the question of whether genomics is a fascinating and tremendously important and highly desirable new phenomenon, or really, 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 really dangerous in the context of race, or perhaps both. So are there any politics in this issue? Well, this was an interview that I did. This project was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It's a big survey that I'll talk mostly about, but we've also done about 50, 60 interviews, elite interviews so far, whose methodology is quite simple, which is I walk into somebody's office and explain the project, and I say, tell me the 3 most important things I need to know. So much for qualitative research methods, right? I mean, these are very sophisticated, very verbal elites who have very strong views. And this interview was basically a disaster. I could not get this man to talk. And I tried this and I tried that. It was early in the project. I thought maybe I just wasn't connecting, or I knew he wasn't dumb because I knew enough about his background. His answer was, there are obviously legal, social, ethical, but there are no partisan dynamics. I don't have partisan conversations. My assistant has to remind me if the member of Congress that I'm going to talk to is a Republican or Democrat. No politics here. Well, of course, as a political scientist, I don't believe that. And I think he's wrong, but it explained to me later on why this interview was such a disaster, where he and I were just simply talking past each other. So, where are the politics? We argue, and I'm just going to flip through and actually not stop on all of these slides because I've got a 45-minute talk to do in about 10 minutes. Basically, let me just get through. Okay, the basic, ignore all this. I loaded the wrong slides. I'm just going to talk my way through it. The basic typology is a 2x2 table that ranges from genetic fundamentalism on the one hand to social construction on the other. That's one of the 2 continua. And roughly speaking, the right tends to believe that there is a genetic component to a variety of human phenotypes. Perhaps intelligence, perhaps aggressiveness, perhaps race. The left, roughly speaking, does not want to believe that there is a genetic component to most human phenotypes. Most obviously race. Race is a social construction. There is no biological meaning to the concept of race, never mind racial boundaries being biologically distinct. There's an interesting exception here, which is sexual orientation, in which the left wants to argue that sexual orientation has a biological component and the right does not. But that's a kind of a sidelight for today's purposes. I'm going to get back to that eventually. The other dimension is technology optimism, technology pessimism. And it's basically can be understood as sort of, it's the other one that says MPSA on it or something like that. So the logic here is essentially risk aversion versus risk seeking, type 1 versus type 2 errors. It's an argument that psychologists have been making. It's also a sociological, even a political argument. So do you basically think that policy ought to be designed around promoting a new and innovative, exciting possibility, or do you basically think policy ought to be designed around protecting against the terrible possible consequences either for society as a whole or for individuals? And if you put this 2x2 table together, which maybe we will, you essentially have the right is conventionally understood biologically determinist, or at least admits of biological elements to human phenotypes, and technologically pessimist, the right being essentially understood to be anti-science, to be fearful of innovation, to be fearful of sort of broad transformations of society. The left is roughly at the opposite end. There we are, I think. The left is, again, conventionally understood to be technology optimist, to be pro-science, to be pro-innovation, to be pro-sort of new and different, and, of course, to be environmentally deterministic thinking, or to be socially constructivist, to put it in the particular context of race. We want to argue that that's not fundamentally wrong, but it's too simple in the arena of genomics for a bunch of different reasons. We have a survey, which we call GCAP. Again, I won't go through the details. I'd be happy to talk about it later. It's basically a 25-minute online survey done by what was then Knowledge Networks. It's racially stratified, racially and ethnically stratified, so we have anywhere from 400 to over 1,000 so conventionally defined, black, white, Asian, Latino, self-defined. So here's the question in it about what we're calling group-inflected genetic inheritance, which is essentially whether there's a biological component or an inherited component to race. As anybody who's tried to write survey questions knows, this is a really hard question to try to figure out to ask in a survey. This is the best we could do, and I'd be more than happy to have suggested. I'm trying to persuade the Broad Institute to do another survey. So anybody who's got better wording, send me an email or grab me afterwards. Essentially, we say that as far as you know, how much does each of the following have to do with a person's race or ethnicity as compared with a person's environment or lifestyle? One of the things wrong with this is environment or lifestyle actually have quite different political inflections, so we need to separate those out later, but for now we didn't. And then there are 8 things which are randomly distributed, 8 response categories randomly distributed across, presented randomly to the survey respondents. Okay. So we summary measure, the response categories are simply all or nothing to do with environment, a mixture, or having to do with race or ethnicity. We summed across the 8 items. What we find is that there's absolutely no difference between Democrats and Republicans in their likelihood of seeing a racially inflected genetic component to a variety of phenotypes, i.e. genetic fundamentalism. There's also very little difference across races. So we could basically, the blacks are slightly less likely to say that, but not very much less likely. And if you do the analyses, there's no statistical significant difference between blacks, Latinos, and whites. Asians are slightly different. And there's no difference between, no partisan difference. So this is simply the politics of this, which are obviously tremendously important to us as scholars of race and ethnicity, don't show up in the public arena, at least by our question. Here's our question about technology optimism or pessimism. We offered 4 genomics, 4 ways in which genomics is used socially. We also have a global warming one as a sort of a check on whether the question makes any sense. Does research on inherited diseases especially likely to affect people of one race or ethnicity? So again, trying to get at the notion of genetic inheritance of phenotypes by race. Or individual development of genetic tests to determine an individual's likelihood, so removing the racial component. And then medical biobanks and legal biobanks. Summed across the questions, we've got, there's basically a little bit, Democrats are slightly more technologically optimistic than Republicans, but only marginally so. There's not very, I don't know why the Asians are too high. Again, there's a little bit of racial difference, but not very much. If you put them together into the typology, that's what you get. And the result basically is that the plurality of the respondents are in cell 2, top right, which is to say, the greater the number of the phenotypes the respondent thinks are disproportionately present in one group due to genetic factors, i.e. there's a genetic component to these various phenotypes that has a racial inflection, the more technologically optimistic they are. The more they think genomics is going to be good for society rather than harmful. So partisanship, there's basically no difference across the parties. In race, there's basically no difference between blacks or Latinos and whites. Asians don't fit in cell 2 quite as much. But the bottom line is that as far as the public is concerned, there is something of a genetically inflected racial inheritance across these 8 phenotypes. And to the degree that one believes that genomic science is going to provide more good than harm to society. So people are basically technologically optimistic about genomics the more they think there's a genetic inheritance. So that's the question. The overall pattern is that first, respondents do actually make sense of these questions. They give sensible kinds of responses. Very few people say the flu is genetically inherited by race. Many people say cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, or eye color is genetically inherited by race. People are cautious but offer a little bit of genetic inheritance around things like intelligence, heart disease, aggression, and so on. So the public responses make sense. They got the question and they kind of get what it's asking about. There's 2 ways of interpreting the fact that sort of more people are in cell 2. That more people, to the degree that you believe in genetic inheritance, you are technologically optimistic. One is that this is a very, very scary result. That it will reify social constructs such as race. Sociobiological perspectives place inordinate attention to genetic factors. And in particular, that we're going to revert to the old racial science, right? We all know about the dangers of dissecting biology and race. So the logic of that one, let me go back to there, is that we as scholars, we as historically knowledgeable elites, we have an educational process. The geneticists do, we as teachers and scholars do, we as elites somehow broadly defined, the media and so on, need to teach people that this apparently innocent association between biology and race is really deeply troubling. We have no evidence that that history can have a positive outcome. The alternative argument is that people in fact can separate, that the American public, somehow broadly defined, is essentially gotten past the old racial science and the old eugenics. Rita Bliss has the best argument about this. She argues in favor of something that she calls race-positive genomics. That people who are working in the science and politics, the elites, actually are using a strategic use of a biologically essentialist definition of race, refusing to recognize the biological processes involved with race is tantamount to scientific racism. So that ignoring the genetics of race is in effect the same thing as colorblind politics broadly defined. So this is a kind of a race-positive genomics argument. The final question, and here's where I stop, is do we trust scientists, political elites, ordinary Americans enough not to freak out by the use of biology and race in the same sentence? And my answer is I have no idea how to answer this. I think it's deeply, deeply dangerous, but I also think there's some evidence that people are really thinking about these issues in historically quite new ways. So I'll stop.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for fixing my